Hello and welcome to my review of Blood of Elves, the first book in the Witcher series. Now I've seen internet, so I know that when you make a video about a popular series that isn't 100% praise, you're supposed to include a kind of trigger warning. Well, consider yourself trigger warned. And I'll throw in a couple of disclaimers as well. I don't speak Polish, which will be obvious when I try to pronounce Andrzej Sapkowski. So I'm working with the translation by Danusia Stock, who I have a sneaky suspicion hasn't done a very good job, which we will return to. Also, I know nothing about the Witcher lore or the wider series, so I'm coming at this completely cold. So Blood of Elves was published in Poland in 1994, but it didn't reach the UK until 2008. And I started with this one because Wiki told me this was book one. But the paratext includes this page, which suggests otherwise. So if it is book one, then it should serve as a good introduction to the series, which, as we'll get into it, I really don't think that it does. The plot is quite fractured, but it generally follows Ciri, who is the daughter of the monarch of Sintra and is orphaned when that kingdom is conquered by Nilfgaard. Nilfgaard remains occupying Sintra, having had their expansion plans thwarted by the other remaining northern kingdoms, who we discover later are evil speciesists and subjugate the other races such as dwarves and elves. The elves in particular are not happy about this. Geralt is a witcher, and there is an unclear prophecy, are there ever any other type, which suggests that Ciri is for them, which is where the book starts really. Geralt finds Ciri after the battle and takes her away. We then skip to a scene where a shady bard is singing songs about Ciri and Geralt by a magic tree, prompting a lot of exposition about prophecies and histories that would have been better served as a foreword. The bard is captured and tortured by a wizard, Rience, who is looking for Ciri, but then he is rescued by Yennefer, a former lover of Geralt. Geralt takes Ciri to the other Watchers, where another former lover, Triss, arrives, because witches are struggling with a girl, witches normally being boys. Triss says they'll have to take her to get a proper education, so they do. On the way, Triss falls ill, so they join a dwarven caravan which gets attacked, and was all apparently a test of the lead dwarf's loyalty, which we will get back to. Ciri is trained in a temple where Yennefer arrives to train her about magic. Geralt tracks Rience and finds him more by chance. There is a fight, Rience escapes, they discover one of their party was never really trying to help them anyway. And the book ends with a long scene which recounts in flashback Yennefer's training of Ciri, which then brings them all the way back to the present day when the book ends. Now, if you're that person that's watched all of my videos, thanks by the way, you will know that I'm a fan of David Gemmell. So much so that this book winning the inaugural Gemmell Award in 2009 was quite a big deal for me. It's quite a recommendation. However, Gemmell's strength for me is his intertwined plotting, starting off numerous threads and then bringing them all back together at just the right time. So my issues with the plot here are numerous. Firstly, its pacing is all wrong, its structure is a mess, and across the whole book nothing is achieved. With regard to the pacing, nothing sums it up better than this final scene with Yennefer and Ciri. There's nothing wrong with the scene beyond its position as the book's finale. This is the point where things should be building up for impact, even if it's just little more than impetus for the sequel, which, given that nothing is resolved in the novel, as I said, seems inevitable even to a Witcher novice like me. The scene is too long, the emotional weight is limited to the revelation that Yennefer and Ciri didn't really like each other, but now they're working through it, as well as redisplaying rather than developing in any meaningful way the already established themes that Ciri's powers are unpredictable and possibly dangerous. This is fairly typical of the novel. There's only really two fights. One is the attack on the caravan. Second is Geralt's killing of Rience's hired thugs, which introduces some of us to the extra-natural aspect of the witches. Interspersed with all of that is some pretty bad exposition. The meeting of the various kings, for example, goes on too long and is couched with a sort of exposition that deliberately hides what it's trying to explain to try and create a sense of mystery. The ruckus that builds after Dandelion sings the ballad of Geralt and Ciri by the tree also needed to go somewhere to be more than obvious exposition. So we have these pages between chapters which sort of detail some of the sort of fictional texts and what they say about this world. It seems like these places could be better used for your exposition than sort of wedging them into your story. because this is a book of B stories that are introduced but not developed. For example, the Dwarven Caravan is a test of the Dwarven leader Yarpen's loyalty. The king sends a convoy of aid, which turns out to be rocks, through a high-risk area. It is ambushed by elven guerrillas. Now there's a number of possible outcomes to this plan. They could all be killed, which would not prove anybody's loyalty, and if it did prove loyalty, it would be irrelevant because they're dead. Yarpen and some of his men could have survived the attack, but when they learned that their friends died for nothing, their loyalty going forward would have to be questioned. Or they could not have been attacked, which would prove nothing at all. So it's not really a very good plan. An actual test of Yarpen's loyalty would be telling him, we're sending your men, but not you, into a trap. What are you going to do about it? Then you know where his loyalty stands. This plan isn't described as a plan by Yarpen either. It's described as a trap, which means it's not a test of his loyalty, but it's an attempt to kill him. Which brings me back to the translator. Is this a mistake of translation, or is this just a really badly thought out part of the book? Regardless, Yarpen is not in the book after this point, so it's B-story at best, and it's filler at worst. Witcher fans can feel free to explain this in the comments, but if your explanation begins with "in the sequel," then you are proving my point that it adds nothing to the story of this book. Now, the structure of the book is very strange. I do not object to a book that doesn't follow the traditional 3-act structure, but as mentioned, the final scene is a very odd way to end a book. The action where it occurs is sporadic at best. The biggest set piece is the caravan trap ambush, which occurs in the middle of the book. We're told Geralt is badass, but he really does very little until the fight with Rience, which should probably have been the finale. But even that doesn't resolve anything, or add much to already explained themes. Secondly, characters which are important to the series come and go from the book without any feeling like they're ever coming back. Triss, for example, comes to help Ciri at the Witcher's fortress, accompanies the caravan, and then disappears from the book. Yennefer is in 2 scenes, one at the start where she rescues the bard from Rience, and the final scene where she trains Ciri, and does nothing much of note between them. The bard Dandelion is tortured and then disappears for something like 200 pages before he returns and is revealed to be a part-time spy. The book fails to achieve anything like a change of pace or a build-up of excitement or even really interest, because you never get any idea of who anybody is or why they're in the series. Nothing is resolved in the story at all. The obvious sequelitis makes this nothing more than a series of introductions to its various B-stories. The kings meet and make a plan, but its enactment in the book is limited at best to sending Philippa to interfere with Geralt and the others. At worst, she does that of her own initiative, and then the scene is pure exposition. And an introduction to book 2, obviously. Philippa's unclear motives, if it's supposed to feel like a great betrayal, it fails to resonate really, as she's barely been in the book to this point. I get the feeling that Sapkowski sets up a lot of his characters to be morally ambiguous, because there is no real clear heroics aside from possibly Yennefer's rescue of Dandelion. For example, Geralt takes Ciri away from the Dwarven caravan to visit some elven ruins in the forest, and when they're leaving they see a train of elven guerrillas, and Geralt tells Ciri not to mention this to the dwarves. But when they return to the caravan, the elves are in the process of attacking it. Given the proximity of elves to caravan, where did Geralt think that they were going? Sapkowski has already established the likelihood of an elven ambush. Instead of making Geralt look grey, it makes him look like a dunce. If you want Geralt to look grey, then they should not notice the elves' approach, return to the caravan, find it under attack, and then he would grab Ciri and they ride the other way. Now, this isn't the only scene that had me scratching my head either. Later on, when Geralt is searching for Rience, a chance encounter with a serving girl leads them to believe a merchant knows where he is. So they go to his house, which is separated from the mainland by a moat, and they need to get the drawbridge down. Initially, this scene is pretty good because Geralt and Dandelion are in disguise and they pretend to be drunk, and Sapkowski describes their mock boorish ways and adds one of them whistling and peeing into the canal, throwing in "and he was out of tune." It's a fun little detail. But the rest of the scene is rather strange. The serving girl and the merchant bellow a conversation across the moat about how she can't come during the day when normal people would visit because it would attract too much attention, whereas shouting across a river in the middle of the night is a strategy replete with subtlety, I'm sure. Perhaps this scene was intended as something of a parody, because Sapkowski clearly has a wry sense of humour. He demonstrates this here and there with a really sharp turn of phrase, such as when he describes the brothel as a place of dubious pleasures and certain gonorrhea. These little touches are fun, and the book desperately needs more of that to alleviate its absence of action and heroics. A lot of fantasy has a certain language about it. Sometimes it's bespoke, sometimes just a bit cliched. But here it's hard to know what is cultural to Sapkowski, what is intentionally created for the book, and what is the product of the translator. For example, the bad guys are from Nilfgaard, which seemed to me a clear compound of Niflheim and the various guards from Nordic mythology. Now, Niflheim is equated, at least by a layman like me, with hell and the underworld, so this name, coupled with the demonic black knight that haunts Ciri's dreams, made me assume that Nilfgaard was something supernatural, or had something supernatural about it. Later we know they're conquering the Northlands with their economy, which really seems at odds with that idea. And the language throughout poses more questions than the book even attempts to answer. In the king's meeting, a lengthy back and forth full of accusations of betrayal and threats of violence is ended by one of them saying, "Can we get serious?" Which makes you question what you've just read. It's now unclear, was that banter? Because I had assumed to that point that it was actually deadly serious. While Wenk, the human leader of the attacked caravan, is a little wordier than most, his line, "I have no categorical interdictions on this matter," seems almost as bizarre as it is horrible. Triss points out that stories usually follow orphans who become princesses, but Ciri is a princess who has become a witcher, and Triss says, "Doesn't that seem daring to you?" Well, no, not really. Additionally, Ciri is an orphan, and without having read any sequels, there is discussion in the book that she might well be a princess or a queen again. So it's not daring, it's just odd. When Rience is interrogating Dandelion, he says to answer his questions with less colourful metaphors. Yet Dandelion hasn't used any metaphors, or even a simile to this point. However, Sapkowski himself uses very strange similes and metaphors, especially about animals. He tells us there's a buzzing like menacing bumblebees. Firstly, menacing and bumble are two words that do not work together. And bees, they're not really menacing. Wasps and hornets, on the other hand. Then he tells us that it was as dark and nimble as a weasel. Well, I assume that this is just slightly awkward phrasing and it should be dark, nimble as a weasel, because I don't associate weasels as being especially dark. But bats, on the other hand, the elven gorillas, one man's terrorists and another man's freedom fighters for sure, they're called squirrels, which is hardly the most terrifying of woodland animals to invoke. Perhaps this is a reference to something else, like some actual real-life band of terrorists/freedom fighters that did adopt this title. Then it does become a little awkward and out of place if it is. However, the dwarves also refer to them as squirrels. So clearly, despite the king's various plots and machinations, they haven't quite got to grips with psyops yet. The book needs another proofread generally as well. There are typos and words that are wrong, more so than you'd expect in a professional novel, but also some interesting and perhaps odd choices of language that might be Sapkowski's or they might be Stock's. There's little bits of repetition here and there, I'll put examples up, which are fairly frequently, but not so often that I can be sure, working with a translation, that this is stylistic and not the product of Stock, having not cared to use a thesaurus. It's not a negative thing as such, but I did begin to wonder, given some of the other language choices demonstrated. There's a man described as a hulking giant. He is 7 foot tall, and he weighs a little under 2 quintals. Well, 7 foot is a lot. It's over 2 meters for metric fans. But quintals means something different in imperial and metric. And as you've stated 7 foot, we have to assume that you're working with imperial measurements. So the man is 7 foot tall and he's 2 quintals, which actually is 200 pounds, which is 14 stone, which is 88 kilograms. For metric friends, I'm 6'3" and about 13 stone. So If you're another 9 inches taller than me, and you've only got another stone on me, you're actually quite skinny, which does not fit this description at all. When he crossed his arms over the chest, it looked like 2 cachalots had prostrated themselves over a whale. 2 quintals in metric, on the other hand, is 200 kilograms, which is 440 pounds or 30 stone. But mixing up your imperial and metric measurements in this way is really poor. From a language point of view as well, I'd suggest that if you want to exaggerate the size of something, then you would tend towards using the biggest number. So if you have a choice between 200 kilograms and 440 pounds, they're the same, but the larger number amplifies the point you're making, so you would go with the 440 pounds, provided you're staying all metric or all imperial. 440 pounds, 30 stone, 2 quintals, this implies a downward scale, even though they are the same thing. One last point is that when you're trying to suggest an excess, some kind of enormity, then you wouldn't really want to say he's huge, he weighs under anything. You would say he's huge, he's over 450 pounds or whatever. Now, our European friends will not mind the use of cul-de-sac on page 233 quite as much as English people. And I found this really anachronistic because cul-de-sac did not come into common usage in England until the late 1800s. In France, it was something like the 13th century, so in a faux medieval setting, perfectly acceptable there. In The Hobbit, just for example, Tolkien uses Bag's End, which is the literal translation, and that fits that story perfectly, as it's kind of fun, but it's also intended as a kind of joke about people using French words in England being a bit pretentious. Sapkowski does write some nice stuff, and his action scenes particularly are solid, if not spectacular. But after Geralt is called into action near the end, and we see some of his capabilities, it makes you bemoan the fact he is absent from so much of this book, and that we don't get to see more of this. In closing, The Witcher is a really odd book. It consists of barely a dozen scenes, none of which is short, and 2 or 3 are blatant exposition. A handful of ideas are introduced, but so little resolution is offered to any of them that it feels like this is barely complete even as a first act. I'm pretty sure that people will like that, like Eriksson's Gardens of the Moon. It's indicative of a string of stories going forward. It definitely gives the feeling that this is a big world with a lot happening. Gardens of the Moon, though, also had a self-contained adventure, the release of the Tyrant and its attack on Darujistan, if I remember the names properly. But literally nothing introduced here is resolved here, and the word count doesn't seem especially high either, certainly not compared to Eriksson. So it seems like charging £8 for what is the first half of a first act is almost a scam. My expectations going into this were huge due to great word of mouth and the devotion of his fan base, but beyond the flash here and there, like Geralt's fight with Rience's thugs, I really can't see what the fuss is about. Thinking back on the various fantasy series that I've delved into since starting this channel, I can see nothing here to make me recommend it over Elric of Melniboné, The Black Company, or even the Malazan series. I think, personally, I'd even be more inclined to read the second Greg Key's Elder Scrolls novel before I read any further into The Witcher. So thank you for watching, and if you're a Witcher fan and you made it this far and you're not too angry with me, then help me out with some of the questions I raised in the comments. And if you are really angry, perhaps a cup of tea and lying down for 5 minutes will help you get over it. Thanks for watching, goodbye.